Welcome to this how-to video discussing how to utilise the recommended grass and clover list when planning a reseed. My name is Siwan Howardson and I will be walking you through how to get the most out of the newly updated recommended grass and clover list this year. Regardless of the system that you run, the recommended grass and clover list is applicable to all grassland farmers, as pasture will make the majority of your diet throughout the year, either as graze grass or as grass silage. Homegrown forage will be the cheapest feed available on farm, with graze grass being the cheapest at a cost of £97 per tonne dry matter, followed by grass silage first cut at 128 tonnes dry matter, and purchase concentrate being the most expensive at £227 tonne dry matter, according to a recent forage costings report by Kingsay. So the key here is that we are making the most of the homegrown forages available to us on farm. Feed and forage remains to be the biggest cost on livestock farms. For dairy farms, feed and forage accounts for 33% of the total cost of production and 25% of the cost for a beef finishing unit, excluding purchase cost for the animal. The same pattern is evident on a beef suckler and breeding sheep farms. Therefore, reducing the feed and forage cost remains to be the biggest opportunity for farmers to improve profitability and reduce the overall cost of production. Previous research has demonstrated that the potential yield of grassland in the UK is 27 tonnes dry matter hectare, where there is no light or moisture limitations. However, the actual yield for all UK grassland is a lot lower and the average is 7.3 tonnes a hectare. This demonstrates that the potential to improve grassland performance and productivity to capitalise on the cheapest feedstuff available to help us decrease the cost of production. Pasture-based systems in the UK will be achieving over 10 tonnes dry matter hectare. The key to a profitable system is to make sure that we're also using the grass produced as much as possible. So converting as much of the grass grown into milk or a kilogram of meat is the key driver for profits in all pasture-based systems. Recent research at AFB in Northern Ireland has reported that improving pasture utilisation by an extra 1 tonne dry matter hectare is worth an additional profit of £334 a hectare a year. To achieve this, there are 4 key areas for improving grass utilisation that we should focus on, ranging from soil health to composition, which covers renewing pasture. And this is where we will focus on in this video. Over the last decade, a 1% increase in yield and quality of new grass varieties has been seen annually, and farms have the information available on the performance and disease resistance of varieties in the recommended grass and clover list, which we will be discussing in this video. So, before we get into the recommended grass and clover list, I just wanted to touch on why reseed. So, renewing pastures regularly is important to maximise productivity and maintain feed quality. Reseeding allows us to improve pasture yield and quality, driving higher farm output and reducing bought-in feed requirements and increasing the net utilisation. It addresses soil compaction problems, introduce improved grass genetic with improved productivity, durability and disease resistance. So if we have a lot of weed grasses such as annual meadow grass in the ley, these will take every opportunity to invade sown pastures and they don't have the red stem that we would see with the ryegrass. Wheatgrass are species that yield poorly, they have a poorer feed quality value, and they do not respond well to nitrogen. Reseeding also allows us to introduce clover into the sward, increases pasture response to fertiliser through using more nutrient-efficient varieties on the market, and it also reduces weed burden. When we are deciding which fields to reseed, it is important that we monitor and plan. Look at fields that might not be performing as well as you would hope and try and decide what the reasons are for that underperformance. It's important to analyse the amount of grass grown on average and for each individual field or paddock and make note of ones below the average. It's worth looking at which fields will give you the greater amount of return in terms of increased tonnes dry matter a hectare. Tetraploids have twice the number of chromosomes of a diploid variety, which makes the cell bigger. This means that they have a larger seed and leaves, and they tend to establish quickly. They are more able to compete when used for overseeding. So tetraploids have a more upright growth habit and are suited for drier growing conditions. In some cases, they have better digestibility and palatability than diploids, where the diploids tend to be more persistent and tiller more freely, and they're generally better suited to wetter growing conditions. Well-managed diploid layers will usually produce a denser swards. Diploids are good for long-term grazing and cutting layers and good for ground cover, whereas tetraploids, as we mentioned before, are good for medium-term cutting layers and in grazing mixtures. In the UK, farmers tend to reseed with a mixture of different grasses and clover, rather than sowing a single variety. Mixtures can produce yield benefits when compared to the same varieties sown individually. They also allow farmers to capitalise on the strength of different species. For instance, the digestibility of a perennial ryegrass can be combined with the yield of a hybrid ryegrass and the superior nutrient value of white clover in one field. Studies undertaken in Northern Ireland have shown that over a 3-year period under stimulated grazing and silage management, there was very little difference between the annual dry matter yield of 9 varieties grown as straight or in a range of mixture combinations. When varieties with close heading dates are sown together, this increases competition between varieties, resulting in an increase in dry matter yield, compared to the average yield of the component varieties sown separately. In contrast, mixtures with a very wide heading date range have a lower yield than the corresponding weighted averages of their components. So this brings me on to the recommended grass and clover list. So just to introduce you to the recommended grass and clover list, this is a list for England and Wales that are drawn up after rigorous testing for attributes such as yield, persistency, quality and disease resistance. Recommended grass and clover list aims to provide information on performance characteristics of grass and clover to grassland farmers to allow appropriate selection of varieties that will perform well in a particular system. The Recommended Grass and Clover List is a cross-industry project, and I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the other partners in this project: British Grassland Society, British Society of Plant Breeders and Hybrid Keep Cymru, the Welsh Red Meat Levy Board, and ourselves AHDB Dairy and Beef and Lamb. The funding in the Recommended Grass and Clover List changed in 2012 so that it was no longer partially funded by merchants, which means that the data can be published and available to all. In order for the grass to be sold in the UK, it needs to pass national list testing, and the Recommended Grass and Clover List trials follow on from these for an extended 3-year period. So in total, it takes approximately 6 years of testing before being presented in front of the Recommended Grass and Clover List Group Committee Board, who decides whether it has met the criteria or whether it is improving agriculture grasses for British farmers. And it is at this point that the variety will be added and listed in the Recommended Grass and Clover List. It is worth noting that as few as 1 in 20 ryegrasses tested and presented in front of the crop committee make it a full recommendation. Data for each grass variety is collected at 6 sites across England and Wales, which you can see highlighted here on the map. Trial plots for each variety are grown outside across 4 of these sites, which are in areas of grassland production. The additional 2 sites, Barenberg and Nyabb Darrington sites, only collect disease data, where disease is encouraged within the varieties, and then the disease resistance is measured to improve our overall accuracy of measuring disease resistance. The trial plots receive nitrogen input representing well-fertilized grassland, which also includes returns of animal manures. Over the 3-year period of trials for the recommended grass and clover list, different cutting regimes are used to compare varieties. This includes, in the first year, conservation management to stimulate silage, in the second year, grazing management techniques, and then in the third year, again, back to the conservation management to stimulate silage. The recommended grass and clover list for the 2019-2020 are available now on the British Grassland Society website. The handbook, which is this one, is very farmer focused, and the full list or merchant copy, which is ideally suited for merchants and breeders or for anyone that wanted a bit more of information. We will now walk through how to use the recommended grass and clover list. So the cost of a grass seed is a small proportion of the expense of reseeding. Yet taking the time to select the right varieties will reap productivity and lifespan benefit, with variety selection being a key component in any reseed. The list aims to provide a tool for you to choose the variety best suited to individual fields, and it's important to maximise the return on investment from a reseeding. There are more than 900 perennial ryegrass varieties available in Europe, so it's important to distinguish which ones will perform the best on your farm. This year we have 8 new varieties of ryegrass and 1 red and 1 white clover have been added to the 2019-2020 recommended grass and clover list. So we will focus on the handbook first, which at the start provides tips to remember when reseeding, and the pasture improvement flowchart to help you assess fields that would benefit from being considered for a reseed. The aim now is to provide you with a quick how-to guide to make the most out of this publication. So just to touch on the new varieties being added to the list. So these are the new varieties that have been added to the list. You can see the majority are grass varieties, with 1 white clover and 1 red clover being added in this year. Okay, so in the handbook, if we look at page 10 for an example, we will see that the recommended list of intermediate perennial ryegrass varieties, which are good for cutting, but can also be used for intensive spring grazing. Intermediate perennial ryegrass are also suggested for a long-term lay. Just to note here that grass are listed depending on their ploidiness, and diploids and tetraploids are assessed separately and presented in their own individual tables within the booklet. Okay, so if we look at the parameters list here, we can see that at the top of the table in the red box, we can see that grasses are listed by heading dates. So earlier the heading date, higher up the table they will be. You can see that the first diploid perennial ryegrass here is Boyne, and that will head around the 20th of May. As you move down the table, the varieties head at a later point in the month. So you can see that we move down to the 24th of May here. The table then provides information regarding grazing and conservation management. And to start with here, we will look at the stimulated grazing management. So the average total yield equates to 9.95 tonnes dry matter a hectare, which equates to 100. So if we look down the table, and if we take Nifty as an example, you can see that this variety yields 104, which is going to be above the average of 9.95 tonnes dry matter a hectare. The figures will vary as you move through the tables, and it's worth noting that grasses producing just below the average, so 99, so one down from the 100 average, will not be producing a significant difference in yield on farm. Next on the top here is the conservation management, the data will be collected in year 2 of the testing. So again, here we see that the average yield and d-value. Following on from this, we have details on ground cover, which is the measure of the persistency within the sward, followed by the disease resistance data, based on a scale of 1 to 9, with 1 being poor and 9 being good in terms of resistance. If we move on to page 14 of the handbook, we have the Italian ryegrass varieties, which are good for silage or hay production and cattle rotational grazing. Italian ryegrass recommended for a shorter lay of 1 to 3 years. They also have a long growing season, which provides an opportunity for early bite grazing, followed by leafy hay or silage cuts. You can see along the top here that we have the majority of the same parameters being provided. So again, in this red box here, but we've got a couple of additional details. Additional parameters in this table to note is the early spring growth and furze conservation cuts, due to the tendency of using these varieties for conservation and early spring growth. And then again, we have the details on ground cover and disease resistance. The handbook also provides recommended lists of hybrid ryegrass varieties and timothy varieties. If we look at this table for Italian ryegrass varieties in more detail, we can pick out 1 or 2 to have a look at here. So in the red box, we have Shakira, which is closer to the top of the table because the heading date is earlier in May than the other varieties in the table. And then if we compare this to Steel, which heads at 21st of May and is further down in the table in the yellow box here. So if we just look at the total annual yield, we can see, so in this column here, we can see that Shakira has the same total annual yield at the average of 17.44 tonnes dry matter a hectare, while Steel is slightly below the average at 99. But remember that this decrease from the average is unlikely to be significant on farm level. Moving on to the d-value, we can see that Steel has a slightly higher d-value figure in comparison to Shakira. Early spring growth for both varieties are above the average at 100, which equates to 1.73 tonnes dry matter a hectare. And then if we look at the conservation cut, whilst both are again above the average in this column here, we can see that Shakira is slightly higher. If we then move across to ground cover, we can see that Steel is slightly higher at 3.9 in comparison to Shakira 3.5, remembering that 1 is poor and a score of 9 is good. Steel also has a higher disease resistance compared to others in the table, being the highest ranking for ryegrass mosaic virus resistance, but on par with Shakira for mildew resistance. Moving on to page 18, we see a recommended list for clover species. So white clover has a high nutritional value, particularly in protein and mineral content, with high palatability, resulting in good animal performance. White clover can provide up to 150 kilograms a hectare of nitrogen for grass growth, reducing the dependence on purchased fertilizer. In the list, white clover are listed depending on their leaf size. So we can see that the top one here is Upper Ace, and it has been listed at the top due to its leaf area of 379. And as we move down the table, the leaf size increases. Okay, so it's important to match leaf size to stock. For example, a small leaf for continuous hard sheep grazing, then a medium leaf for frequent cutting and rotational grazing, and larger leaves for cutting and cattle grazing is recommended. So after leaf area, the next column for the clover is the total yield of clover that is estimated in the third harvest year. In this instance, we are looking at an average of 100, equating to 4.20 tons dry matter a hectare, with the figures then providing a guidance if the varieties are above or under the average. The next, we have the total yield of grass and clover, which gives a measurement of how the grass and clover interacts in terms of yield within the sward. And the last column here is for ground persistency. So after light defoliation is estimating ground cover after silage harvesting or cattle grazing, while after hard defoliation is after sheep grazing. Again, this is based on a scale of 1 to 9, with 1 being poor and 9 being good. So again, if we look at comparing a couple of clover varieties, we can see that grassland demand is higher up in the table within that red box due to the smaller leaf area in comparison to Alice, which is in that yellow box, which has a leaf area of 1,097 squared. Total yield of clover for grassland demand is below the average of 100, which equates to 4.20 tons dry matter hectare, while Alice is above the average at 102. Moving on, we can see that total yield of grass and clover is again below the average for grassland demand, whilst Alice is on par with the average, equating to 11.35 tons dry matter hectare. In regard to ground cover, we can see that grassland demand has better scores for hard defoliation, while Alice has a slightly higher score for ground cover. Ground cover after light defoliation. On page 19, the recommended list for red clover is available. So red clover is also high in protein, and red clover silage can provide crude protein content of up to 19%, depending on the percentage of red clover in the sward. It provides high yields with no or low nitrogen fertilizer generally, but it generally only lasts for 3 years. Red clover is a good option for cutting and finishing stock on in the autumn. If we look at the table, it's similar to the list for white clover, with the yield of first cut and total annual yield. In addition, for red clover, we have crude protein and ground cover values. Lucerne and Coxfoot also have a descriptive list, which are available under the recommended grass and clover list on the British Grassland Society website, which detail the varieties available within England and Wales, but don't have the same rigor as the previous list we have mentioned. So briefly, I'd just like to move on to the full recommended grass and clover list, so the merchant guide, which provides a more complete data set for more in-depth look at the performance of grass and clover for anyone wanting more detail. This also provides regional disease information to provide information about the risk and therefore the priority, and more detail about different cutting management and parameters used to assess varieties. So within the tables in the full list, you have the first set of columns consist of grazing management. This includes the total grazing yield as a percentage of the average of all varieties of the grazing D value, provides an indication of grass quality, again with 100 being the average. The second set shows the seasonal growth, performance of varieties and the stimulated grazing. In this, you can see early grazing yield, which would be based on the first stimulated grazing cut, followed by yield data for the following stimulation cuts. Conservation management consists of total harvest yields from first and third harvest year, followed by the average total yield over the entire trial period. The second set of columns here look at agronomic characteristics, such as ground cover and disease resistance. It also includes information on breeders, agents, and the number of trials carried out for each variety. The main agronomic characters consist of overall ground cover, with again a rating of 1 to 9, with 9 being good. It also provides an assessment of the percentage of ground cover in autumn and the third harvest year. This is expressed as a percentage and is a good indication of the persistence crop over harvest years and into late grazing season. Winter hardiness is also shown and expressed on a scale of 1 to 9 again, with 1 being poor and 9 being good. In the full list, grasses have assigned a letter, and we either have G for general use, S for recommended specific use, PG for provisional general use recommendation, and PS for provisional specific use recommendation. The aim of these status is to give an indication of why the grass has been listed, depending on its performance in trials. So if a grass has been listed as a G variety, it is known as a good all-rounder in terms of performance. S variety is deemed to be a good performer and would be useful for a specific use. Not as good as a G variety, but have enough credentials to be listed for a specific use. PG and PS have provisionally been listed and will be reviewed again at a later date when more data has been gathered in further trials. So the 3 key steps to making the best use of the recommended grass and clover list is a checklist to help you when selecting varieties for reseeding. So the step 1 is to ask yourself, is this variety on the list? Step 2, after checking if it's on the list, make sure that the type of grasses or clovers listed in the mixture are fit for purpose. So ask yourself, what will the sword be used for? So you've got individual varieties that perform better under silage rather than grazing management, and vice versa. It's important to consider whether the reseed will be mostly cut or mostly graze, as selecting the correct varieties for use can have a significant impact on financial return. And step 3 is refinements can be made to mixtures in consultation with your merchants. So have a chat, describe to them what you're trying to achieve, and just make sure that you are getting the best mixture possible. Thank you very much for joining this how-to video. As I previously mentioned, the recommended grass and clover list are available to download on AHDB website or the British Grassland Society website.